The first segment, you'll get 2.5 minutes for your intro, and we'll be talking a lot, so I don't know if we're going to get to everything. I have 30 seconds to ask a question. I'll try and do that well. You'll each have a minute to respond. There'll be a red light there, which means 30 seconds. Yellow is 15, and I will kindly wrap you. Kindly would be the word. So after we do that, we'll have a Q&A session where audience members can come up to the podium. 10 questions or however many the time will allow. Again, candidates will have 1 minute to respond to the question. And then again, your closing arguments for 2.5 minutes. So are you set to go? No, okay, let's go then, huh? I feel like we're playing a game show here. So we'll talk to it really is in some ways if you think about it. Let's talk about international policy and immigration reform, obviously a big issue that's making headlines right now. Right? I'm sorry, the opening statements, I jumped ahead of myself, sorry. The towing costs, Nigel. Ms. Baer, please, your opening statement, sorry about that.
Baer, and I am running to represent our community in Congress. This is the district where I was raised, where I went to local public schools, and where 4 generations of my family have made ends meet and gotten to know their community selling furniture for a living. I got my career started as a lawyer, taking the fight to take money out of politics all the way up to the Supreme Court. I then served for 6 years in the Obama administration, working as a senior advisor to 2 different secretaries of state and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I work to keep our country safe and to protect American values. But let me tell you this, I never saw a case in a courtroom or a crisis in the Situation Room where there was as much on the line as there is this year, especially for young people. I care about millennial voters because I am a millennial voter. Okay.
You heard you.
I got a loud voice anyways. So I care about millennial voters because I am a millennial voter, and I know one thing is true. If we don't do right by the generation that holds the keys to our future, well then that future looks pretty bleak for all of us. We simply cannot afford to allow a generation to graduate from college saddled with student debt and unable to find jobs that pay a living wage. We cannot call our country just when our criminal justice system perpetuates the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We cannot say we are protecting our environment when we've got a climate change denialist at the head of the EPA and a congressman who engages in antics in front of TV cameras, but then behind the scenes takes votes that makes our air and water dirtier. We can't live up to the American promise if we deny citizenship to dreamers and if we separate babies from their parents at the border. And we cannot say that we value the life of each and every one of us if we allow our children, our classmates, our colleagues to die from gun violence on the streets and in our neighborhoods. What I know from my time in Washington is that Washington can work if we send the right kind of people. And I'm looking forward to you joining me in that journey. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
I just want to jump in here and say I asked the candidates to please follow by the time rules and yellow and red, right? No, red is 15 or you're done practically, basically. Wrap it up.
Good evening. My name is Pam Keith. I am a veteran of the United States Navy and the daughter of a U.S. diplomat. I grew up in a household where my job, even as a little one, was to project the values that we share and hold dear across this incredible globe. Not only did I serve my country, I served my fellow Americans in many other ways. I've been an attorney for 20 years, so yeah, I've got a little seasoning on me, but I've learned a few things along the way. I followed in my father's footsteps into the military for a very peculiar reason. He said to me when I was young, Pam, you don't serve the country you have. You serve the country you want to have. And that is what sacrifice is all about. I'm here to tell you, not about me, because anybody can do that. I'm here to actually tell you about you. Because here's something you need to know. The power of the future is in your hands. Everything that we are doing right now is going to be picked up by you in your taxes, in your future. So if we blow up the debt, then that's on you. And if we make bad decisions right now, then you pay the consequence. So what I'm here to tell you is not how much power I have, but how much power you have. Because if you're not voting, you're handing that power to someone else. If you're not paying attention, you're handing that power to someone else. If you're not listening, you're handing that power to someone else. So while I'm here to sell you on me, yes, I do want you to vote for Pam. I'm here to sell you on you. The future that we have, the things that you value, a good education, free medical care for everyone that needs it, and Medicare coverage for all, the decriminalization of cannabis, the taking care of our veterans, the cleaning of our waters, it's not up to me, it's up to us.
Thank you to both of you. Now to the questions. We'll talk about the international policy and immigration reform. We know about President Trump's zero-tolerance policy when it comes to immigration, and we know all about the refugee crisis that's happening at our border right now, the crisis that we're having on our border. What do you believe is right, or what do you believe is wrong with the President's zero-tolerance policy right now?
Well, I'll tell you this. I have a zero-tolerance policy as well. I have a zero-tolerance policy for racism, for xenophobia, for hatred, for an administration that represents the worst of our country instead of the best of American values. Our immigration system is broken, and we are in need of comprehensive immigration reform. We can start with a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, as well as other undocumented individuals who are not criminals, but are contributing members of our society. We can increase pathways to immigration for highly skilled immigrants. And we can do all of this while we are keeping our country safe. These things are not mutually exclusive. Each and every one of us in this room, unless you are a Native American, your family immigrated here from somewhere. And if we are going to represent the very best of American values, we have to represent a country that is a beacon of hope for those around the world.
Thank you, Ms. Baer. Ms. Keith.
I would hold this administration criminally liable for the reunification of these families. If they don't put those families back together, then they should be facing criminal penalties of their own. Because what they did to these families is fundamentally criminal. It had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with scaring people from coming to our shores in the first place. The people who are the most terrorized where they are. So I think that's the first thing. But we have to admit that everything we talk about in terms of immigration is deeply steeped in xenophobia. It's deeply steeped in this fear that our nation will somehow look differently 50 years from now than it looks now. Well, guess what? It looks differently now than it did 50 years ago, and I thank God for it. It's okay. We don't know what an immigrant wave is going to do until we look back and see at those contributions. The same can be said for the Irish, the Japanese, the Italians, and every other wave of immigrant. Immigration is the core of the fabric of the United States because we are so much more than the sum of our parts.
Thank you, Ms. Keith. Curious, do you believe that the president actually had some type of plan in place when he was given a deadline to reunite these families?
I think it has.
Because I'd never heard one before, so I'm curious if either one of you had.
I think it has been clear from the beginning that there is no plan. All you have to see is the fact that we went through a deadline yesterday for reuniting children under age 5 with their parents, and we missed it. Because this administration was shooting from the hip. But they were shooting from the hip when people's lives were at stake. They were doing it when it was contrary to American values, and by the way, also contrary to U.S. law. We need to hold this administration accountable and say, enough is enough with playing with people's lives in this way. Our country is better than this. For our decades, for centuries, we have been a beacon of hope for people around the world, and we have to continue to be so.
Ms. Baer, is our country playing with people's lives?
I'm sorry.
Ms. Keith, is our country playing with people's lives?
Absolutely it is, and it was absolutely callous in doing so. But we have a mechanism to hold people accountable when they do crazy things. We call it civil and or criminal contempt. I have a funny feeling those families would get reunited pretty quickly if Ms. Nielsen was put in jail, because that's where she belongs for the decisions that she made here. What she did was violate national and international law, and do so with a very intentional purpose of terrorizing the families that are here and keeping those from coming here, from crossing our borders. These are asylum seekers. They are not illegals. There's nothing illegal in seeking asylum. There is something terribly illegal in taking children from their parents. So if there's a criminal here, it's her. She needs to go to jail.
Is there anything that differentiates the two of you when it comes to this? Because it sounds like you have very similar messages.
I would say that it's just a question of approach. I will start with the premise that Lauren and I are both Democrats, we're both decent humans, and we want to see a country that we are proud of. But it's simply a question of making sure that we're willing to stand up and call things out the way they are. I am not the person that's going to start out by reaching across the aisle, especially if the door on the other side has been shut in our face. And sometimes, you just have to be willing to call evil out for what it is. Because when I took that oath of office to protect the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, it never sunset. I will do it now, tomorrow, until the day I die.
Let me be clear about one thing. A true leader never, never, never compromises on their values. Never compromises on their values, but at the same time is always driving towards solutions. Now, I believe your question was, did Pam and I differ on immigration policy? And the answer to that question, I think, is really only in a matter of approach. I see a situation right now where we are dealing with children, babies, who are no older than my daughter, who's not yet 2 years old, who are separated from their parents. And my first concern would be the pragmatics of getting those kids back to their parents, getting our law enforcement enforcing the law. I don't want to grandstand talking about locking up cabinet officials instead of doing the realistic hard work it's going to take to fix our immigration system now. I am never going to promise to you that I will do something that I can't arguably do from my position as a member of Congress.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to move on to the algae crisis. Just a short time ago, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Congressman Mast asked for FEMA help because of the situation that's going on right now. I saw the map of the satellite imagery from NOAA back in June, where Lake Okeechobee had no algae. Now it has more than 90%. This has been affecting people for years. I went with the River Kids to Washington, D.C., where they brought their message to Congressman Mast. So they brought their message to Congressman Mast. He listened. There were some other congressmen who listened as well. What is your plan to address this issue, since it has been around for so many decades, I believe, because it started, with sugar? Mm-hmm. Sugar money. So that's why the water is flowing to the west and flowing to the east, the Treasure Coast. There have been so many people who have said to me, I want my future generations of my family to enjoy what I've been able to enjoy. So many families have said that. So obviously this applies to anyone here who believes in that whole system. So, Ms. Keith, how do you go ahead and protect our ecosystem, or get us away from this crisis, which it seems no one has been able to do?
Well, that's because we've been taking the wrong approach. And the good news is I have a plan. You see, it has 3 parts. Instead of convincing Floridians who already know what our problem is, we need to convince the people who hold the purse strings of appropriations to actually appropriate the projects that we need to send water down south to the Everglades that is cleaned. That requires 3 things. First of all, we need to stop making this a local problem. If you know about deforestation in the Amazon, then they should know about the St. Lucie River. We have kept it too much local. The second thing is we have to get the people who appropriate the budget here. They have to see it, and not just them, but their spouses, their children, and their family members. They need to understand how of a severe ecological problem we are creating. And the third thing is we have to move their voters to pressure them, because our voters will not pressure them. Their voters will pressure him. The good news is that Democrats believe in environmental stewardship, and I cannot wait to get to Congress with a new leadership that actually values the projects that will clean the water. We have to have a new approach, and that is it.
Thank you.
Let's be clear here. This isn't just an environmental problem. It is an economic problem for our community. It is a health crisis for our community. And they're 2 different issues, and they often get conflated. One is the issue of discharging dirty water from Lake Okeechobee into the St. Lucie River. And we deal with that by building an EAA reservoir south of the lake, by funding that reservoir, by funding appropriations for the SERP plan, which we've had since 2000, and by ensuring that the water goes south. Now, there's a second problem that we have, and that's why is there algae there in the first place? And that is because we have for decades allowed people to dump into Lake Okeechobee, sugar from the south, industry from the north, and we've got to deal with that. Brian Mast doesn't talk about that issue. He is taking votes specifically that allow chemical pollutants to drop more chemicals into our water. We're never going to solve our algae problem unless we put hard limits on the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in our water, unless we deal with septic tank conversion in Martin County, unless we move us to a cleaner water system.
Who is going... If a person who's told me this has been around since the 50s, 60s, they may be correct. I didn't do a fact check on that. But if it's been around for so long, how do one of you think that you're going to be able to get involved to solve that problem?
I mean, I think the first thing you have to admit is that Tallahassee has been in control of the GOP for 20 years. We've been under the thumb of Rick Scott, and it's all been bamboozlement from top to bottom when it comes to caring for our environment. So we voters have to make a better choice of who we send into positions of power, because those choices matter every single day. I think Lauren is right. We do have a bunch of problems, but what we have is a representative of Florida's 18th congressional district that giveth with one hand and taketh away with the other, because he feels like gutting revenue is the right way to fund the programs that we need, which is the 180 of the truth.
Let's be clear, algae may have been around for a long time, but our problem is getting worse. Why? An algae bloom requires 3 things: water, nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, and heat. And what's been happening over the last 50 years? Our climate has been getting hotter, because we've dealt with climate change denialists in Tallahassee and climate change denialists in Washington. So lest you think that this problem we're dealing with here on Lake Okeechobee is disconnected from the broader problem of how we are dealing with climate change, whether we are moving to a low carbon and clean energy future, and whether we are keeping and enforcing and enhancing our environmental protections, or doing what Brian Mast and Republicans in Florida and in Washington have done for decades and roll those back, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take actual environmentalists in D.C. to make a change here.
Ms. Keith, anything to add? I know that you've been more aware and attentive to the time than I have.
I would absolutely echo the sentiment that every choice that we make has a ramification in our district. Absolutely, we have to understand that pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, while it seemed flashy and interesting, it did the opposite of what we need in this district. Gutting the EPA totally flashy and, oh, I'm cutting regulations. Yeah, but you're also polluting the environment. The thing is that Brian was supposed to be going to Washington to represent us. You know, that's what his job was. The chemical companies have lobbyists. They have somebody who speaks for them. The corporations have lobbyists. They have somebody speaking for them. He was supposed to be speaking for us. And instead, he's taken money from those very same interests, and he has helped them accomplish their goals instead of helping us accomplish ours. And so we have to be real clear about this. We need a change in leadership, a change in representation, and a change in attitude. That's it.
That's it. Okay,
That's it.
so we'll move on to climate change, as you brought up a little moment earlier. We talk about the sea levels rising. We'll need to essentially update our infrastructure and, combat the threat of the of frequent flooding. How can we go ahead and combat climate change if indeed you do believe in it?
Well, yes, I believe in climate change because climate change is a scientific fact. And let's be clear here, we're not just talking about sea level rise and flooding. This is an existential crisis for the state of Florida. The latest projections show that in 50 years, all of Florida that is below 6 inches above sea level will be underwater. That's an economic crisis of epic proportions for our state. That undermines our very way of life. That changes our geography. So it's not just about re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement, because guess what? That was a voluntary agreement that depended upon countries making their own domestic changes. We can go now back to the standards that the Obama administration set. We can stop rolling back environmental protections, and instead we can enforce them. We can move towards a clean energy future, and by the way, that's beneficial not only for the country, but for Florida, because guess what we have in abundance? Sun.
Ms. Keith, how can we, as you get up, how can we combat this?
Look,
How do we roll this back?
Quite frankly, Obama undershot it. Those regulations were still unambitious enough. And look, I understand that having a clean energy grid is important, but can we please accept the fact that we have cars that burn fossil fuels all over our roads, and that we have the technology right here, right now, to have electric cars and clean cars that don't do that? We shoot too low. We're supposed to be the leaders of the world when it comes to new technology and clean energy. So as far as I'm concerned, Paris Climate Accord may have been voluntary. It was a step in the right direction, but the United States can take a much bigger step and can do so right now if it stops counting down to car companies that don't want to face a future that is fossil fuel free.
I want to move on to something that everyone has been talking about since February 14th, and that's the Stoneman Douglas massacre. So we'd like to talk about public education and safety. I just wanted to see where I had some notes. We talked locally about Fort Pierce Central High School, 3,000 plus students, 5 to 8 guidance counselors for the entire school, who are talking about college, I would imagine. Let's see. At this school, entrances were locked down that weren't before or after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. You couldn't go through certain entrances that were blocked off. I asked someone, do you feel safer? They said yes, apart from external security measures. Now, teachers required to lock out things down, sign out sheets. Do you think they did the best that they could with the time that was given? Do you have an overall sense? Yes, and that's insecurity. Someone knocks on their classroom door, everyone gets tense. Someone knocks on a classroom door, and everyone in the classroom gets tense because they don't know who is on the other side of the door. I remember Columbine.
I do.
I'm sure many in the crowd, here at the forum today, if you don't know it, you can look it up. But it started the beginning of something that has plagued our country for a long time, and it recently hit very close to home for us. So, what legislation do you think can or will prevent the next school shooting? Or is there any? Ms. Keith, we'll begin with you.
Well, I think we can stop with the thoughts and prayers after the fact and start working on prevention. So what I'm proposing is that we insert the process of risk assessment before somebody gets their hand on a weapon. We have that system right now before you get into a car. We call it liability insurance. Everybody has to have it. It's not because you want to, but because when you get in your car, you are a risk to the people around you. The same concept applies to guns. When you own one, it becomes a higher risk to the people around you. And insurance companies are in the business and the process of risk assessment. They use actuarial science to determine who is and who is not a high risk. The beautiful thing about this is we know that insurance drives safer behavior. We wear our seatbelts. We have car inflatable, pillows to make sure that we don't get hurt. And not only that, insurance puts money behind you. But more than anything else, insurance puts up the red flags when they say you're too high of a risk in the first place. Because as much as we got to worry about our schools, we got to worry about every other building we've got. We can't shut down every building, every beach, every theater, every shopping center. The bottom line is the issue isn't only in our schools, it's everywhere. And the answer to the problem is risk reduction. That's the answer, prevention.
Risk reduction and prevention. What would you say?
I have a baby girl. I can't imagine sending her to school one day and not having her come home. As Pam said, this isn't just about our schools. Since Columbine, we have seen mass shootings in our community centers, in our neighborhoods, at concert halls, even in our places of worship. We know exactly what we need to do. We need universal background checks. 96% of Americans agree. We need to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and the mentally ill. We need to ban bump stocks. We need to get weapons of war off our street. We need to treat gun violence like the public health crisis that it is and fund the CDC. We need to make sure that we don't allow the NRA's plan to have concealed carry reciprocity go through and allow people from other states to carry their weapons into our streets. And by the way, we need to wrestle away Congress from the vice grip of the NRA.
Ms. Baer, while you're still standing. Ms. Baer, I heard a lot of we needs. We need. What are you going to do? You.
I'm going to sponsor legislation that does each and every one of those things.
Right.
We have in our current representative, Brian Mast, someone who has more than $32,000 in contributions from the NRA and its employees on his federal campaign finance records. We have someone who said he supported an assault weapons ban and then did nothing about it. Legislation is written, this can be done on day one, period.
Right. And I can't disagree that that can be done, but that only addresses about 156 deaths a year. The other 33,000 is from handguns, not AR-15s, not bump stocks, and so forth. So I think we got to think a little bit bigger if we want to see fewer gun deaths. And that's why I think it's important that we don't have background checks as the answer, because, again, who's doing those background checks? Right now it's gun sellers, as if they don't have a conflict of interest, or it's Adam Putnam's office, as if they didn't miss 250,000 background checks. The reason this isn't going right is because the whole system doesn't make any sense. We need a new system that inserts risk assessment that goes beyond just convictions, and that's exactly what insurance does. It pulls up red flags and it puts you on a continuum of risk, including the kind of weapon that you want to buy. So what I'm talking about is systematic change to address those 33,000 dead Americans. And let me say it as clearly as I possibly can. If you are okay with 33,000 dead Americans, you are no kind of patriot.
Ms. Baer, this is one of the key things that everyone has talked about, essentially, these background checks. Do you believe in them, whereas Ms. Keith, not necessarily so, because there's, like you said, there's a conflict of interest. So there's got to be some way to start this process out, no?
Background checks are necessary but not sufficient to deal with our gun violence problem. We know that from the number of people who haven't passed background checks or bought guns at gun shows or in parking lots and have then gone on to shoot not necessarily up their schools, but their domestic partners, their neighbors, commit suicide. I don't disagree with Pam's idea about liability, and I would actually go one step further. I think we need to hold gun manufacturers liable for creating weapons that cause mass harm in our society. Liability is a mechanism we have in our judicial system to make sure that people are only making products that are safe and can be safely used. We know from the number of deaths we have in this country that that's not the case right now.
From a theoretical perspective, I think we've got a problem with that notion because a gun is designed to kill. So if it does what it's designed to do, then it's not really a product's liability issue. I think there are things that we can do to make guns safer, right? Fingerprint triggers and other things. But I don't want to move the responsibility off of where it belongs. Right now, the kids in Parkland, who's paying their medical bills? They are, or we are, the taxpayers. Now, how does that make any damn sense? It doesn't. If you want to own a gun, then you have the financial responsibility about everything that goes from that gun. I don't want to shift it to the manufacturer. I don't want to shift it to the state. I don't want to shift it to anybody else. You buy that gun, you bought it, you break it, you own it. It is your financial responsibility. It's the way it should be. It's the thing that makes sense.
There is no incentive for gun manufacturers to start introducing safety mechanisms on their gun unless there is some form of liability for failure to do so. We see this throughout the consumer products industry. Gun manufacturers are one of a select group of industries that is immune from liability. Why are they immune from the liability? 3 letters, NRA. We need to stop making an exception for those who manufacture guns.
Your thoughts on Congressman Mast and his reversal with the AR-15, I'm curious.
You know, I think Congressman Mast is very good at doing exactly what he needs to do within the district. But you know a person not by what they say. You know a person by what they do. Now, if Brian was actually serious about bringing an end to AR-15s, he wouldn't be talking to us. He'd be talking to Kevin McCarthy. He'd be talking to Scott Womack. He'd be talking to the people of his own caucus who have the ability to actually move legislation. Have you ever seen Brian Mast actually talk to other Republicans and get them on board with his idea? That is the key sign of political pandering. He tells us what he thinks we want to hear because he knows his caucus will never back him up on it and they'll never hold him responsible for going against their wishes. He's just given permission to say what he has to say in a swing district. But Brian Mast, we see you and we see where your money comes from too.
Thank you, Lucie. Obviously, a very heated issue. Obviously a very emotional issue. I remember the day, the prom for the seniors, and I remember having to write the newscast for that day. That I believe it was a Saturday, and tears came to my eyes to think of the fact that those 4 seniors wouldn't be graduating that day, wouldn't be going to prom that day. Obviously a very close to home emotional issue, but will there be an answer? Can there be an answer now? Columbine happened how long ago? More than 20 years? Date myself, 20? What is it that you can do and stand up here and say, I am going to do this, so the teens, who's ever a student in here, what is it that you're ever going to do that will make them not feel nervous once someone knocks at that door? I want to know what you're going to do, what your plan is.
There can be an answer. There has been an answer for decades. It is simply the case that Congress has refused to act. They refuse to act after Columbine, they refuse to act after Virginia Tech, and after Sandy Hook, and after Las Vegas, and after Parkland. It is not that complicated. The legislation is written. Why are we not passing it? Congress is in the hands of the Republicans, and they're in the vice grip of the NRA. So what will I do? I will go on the first day that I'm in office and co-sponsor bills that do exactly what I have just said. Universal background checks, assault weapons ban, banning bump stocks, an end to concealed carry reciprocity, proper funding for the CDC, end to immunity for gun manufacturers. These are things we can do if we have the political will in Congress. It is solely a question of political will, and that's something Brian Mast lacks. He can say things in public, but he never returns his NRA money. Nor did he ever co-sponsor a bill that was already written that had more than 150 other co-sponsors that did exactly what he said he wanted. Banned assault weapons, but didn't confiscate them from their current owners. It is not that hard. You just need to send people to Washington who are actually going to sponsor and pass bills.
Thank you, Ms. Baer.
I'm afraid you asked the wrong question, sir. You asked me what I'm going to do, and the question is, what are we going to do? Because this millennial generation understands how to shut something down. I'm so proud of them. I don't know if you saw what they did in Washington, but they got themselves organized. They organized this here, right now. It isn't up to me, and it's certainly not up to Lauren. It's up to us. And the thing is, we are already seeing what they're doing. They made Publix back down from their contributions to Adam Putnam. We watched what they did in making the NRA lose sponsorship virtually overnight. Do you know how badass these kids are with social media? Do you know how quickly they can shame somebody out of their stupidity? Do you know how effective they are at raising the moral conscience and putting up the mirror to somebody's face and say, look at yourself. What are you doing? It's not up to me, it's up to us. And I'm so grateful for it.
Thank you to the candidates. Let's give them a round of applause for their individual answers for that.
There.
Come on.
I love you.
Okay, so I believe the second round, it's like a game show here, the second round, no offense, will be audience Q&A. So whoever has questions, which ones?
The other set of questions about
You-
the next ones.
Which ones?
We don't have to go into the second segment.
Okay, I thought we have an hour? Yes. Okay, sorry. Moving on. Let's talk about something that really affects people, millennials, and that would be, and other people for that matter, not just millennials, lowering tuition for universities and addressing the student debt crisis. Ms. Keith, I think you say that there has to be a pass where college education is free, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, I believe very much that education is the crane that lifts people out of poverty. It puts them on their path. And I believe that college education should be free, comma, for those people that are also willing to invest in their country. I don't think it should be free for any old person, any old place, any old time, because I went to college with people who didn't take their college seriously, who partied away that opportunity. And I don't think the taxpayers should pick up that bill. But if you are willing to serve in an area of critical need for the country, education, healthcare, environmental stewardship, technological research, if you're willing to do that, then we ought to be willing to invest in you. It's a win-win for us to get the best and the brightest to commit themselves to serving in an area of critical need for our country, and it ensures that they see that service to country is something of high value and to be rewarded and aspired to. I think that's the right answer.
Thank you. Ms. Baer, a pass for those who serve our country. A pass for those who serve our country?
I understand the burden of student debt. My wife didn't finish paying off her law school loans until last year, 10 years after she graduated from law school. There's no reason that we should be sending our students out into the working world with crippling debt at the very same time that there's a dearth of well-paying jobs. I agree that we need to find a way to make college tuition free and give a break to those who are committed to service. The way we do that is through programs that are loan forgiveness for those who choose to go into service afterwards. And as long as you are serving, as long as you're a policeman or a fireman or a teacher or a nurse, your loans are forgived. And if you choose to go into a different line of work, well, then you pay in for your education. It's a choice that individuals will have to make. But I also agree our government can be doing more now. Do you know that the federal government has the power to lower student loan interest rates, but they choose not to do so? We need to demand that. We need to pass legislation requiring that.
Thank you. Ms. Keith, I want to just go back to what you said originally. Can we as a nation afford to give that pass?
Can we afford to do it? I'll put it this way, we don't have a resource problem. We have a resource allocation problem. The people we send to Washington are sent there to make choices in our best interest. And somehow we find a way to cut taxes and cut revenue so that the Ferrari doesn't get lonely without the Maserati next to it. We find ways of compensating CEOs of companies that make all of their money off of taxpayer programs and give them $22 million bonuses and golden parachutes. We tax diapers, milk, and gas, but we don't tax shares in Pepsi-Cola. We make choices every day, and we can make better choices. We can make choices that work for every person, the working man, the working woman who's trying to get ahead in the country that has the greatest promise of any on the planet. That's not, do we have enough problem? The question is, do we have the courage to make smart money choices?
Every time Congress passes a tax provision, they make a choice. Who's a winner? Who's a loser? This administration, Brian Mast, Republicans, they've made a choice. The winners are the wealthiest among us, the ultra-wealthy, the most fortunate, and big corporations. You know who could be winners instead? Working people, students, young people. These are choices we can make. We can adjust our tax code to incentivize young people going to college. And by the way, while we're talking about college education, let's also acknowledge that college isn't the right choice for everyone. We need to be increasing opportunities for technical and vocational education so that you can do what you used to be able to do 50 years ago, which is graduate high school career ready.
Thank you.
And what should be waiting on the other side is well-paying union jobs.
Thank you. This question revolves around criminal justice, and it centers around marijuana. Your view on legalizing recreational use of it, and if you're in favor, what is your plan to decriminalize it or expunge records of people who have these charges?
Yeah, I fully support the decriminalization of cannabis. I'll tell you why, because it never did make any sense. If we criminalize intoxicants, then Jack Daniels should be illegal. If we criminalize things that are bad for you, then cigarettes should be illegal. The reason we criminalized cannabis is because it competed with both cigarettes and alcohol. It competed with opioids and pharmaceuticals. It was never morally sound to begin with. It was an easy and cheap way to put people of color in jail. That's what it was always about. So yeah, my plan is very simple. It's not really complicated. Decriminalize it, take it off the scheduled substance list, and have restorative justice for the people's lives who have been destroyed by criminal records that keep them from being able to have jobs and care for their families. If we really want to put people in jail, how about putting human traffickers in jail and rapists and murderers instead of the people who choose to deal with the life stresses by getting high instead of getting drunk?
I support the decriminalization of marijuana. And the reason I do is because it makes sense from a health perspective, and it makes sense economically. This isn't just an issue of medical marijuana, although there are incredible benefits there, especially when we're looking at our opioid addiction crisis and being able to prescribe marijuana instead of highly addicted drugs. This is a criminal justice issue. for our community, and it's an issue that has disproportionately affected Black and brown men for decades. We have seen in states that have decriminalized marijuana not only that it is regulated, that we are able to see a source of revenue for states, but also that there can be responsible use. It can be a win for everyone. So I think we need to move in that direction, and I think we need to talk about looking at individuals who have had criminal sentences because of this and exonerating them.
Can I?
Ms. Baer, what do you say to people who completely disagree with you that marijuana should not be decriminalized? Smoking marijuana, using it, whatever, possessing should be a crime. What do you say to them?
There are so many problems in our society, so many things and behaviors that people engage in that are genuinely dangerous, harmful, destructive to the moral fabric of our society. Using marijuana is not one of those. And by the way, if we regulate use the way we have in other states and in other countries, it becomes safer. You no longer have individuals on the street buying a marijuana cigarette that's laced with chemicals and sending them to the ER. So this, again, is an issue of priorities. And where do we want our priorities to lie in the criminal justice system? I think we need to focus on things that are actually harmful to our communities.
Some people would say, Ms. Keith, that marijuana is harmful to the community. It's changed over the years, as
Right.
we know. It's changed
Yeah.
over the years.
Yeah.
Marijuana was not legal when I was born,
No, no.
and it's certainly amazing to see how it's changed. So what do you say to that? Let's say to some parents who don't believe in it.
Well, I'll tell them that, there's a fiscally responsible position here, right? Because every time you put someone in the criminal justice system, you are burdening the taxpayers. You may be putting somebody else away, but we're paying the bill. So where's the fiscal responsibility in putting people in jail for something that doesn't harm the community? That's number one. Number two, we're the Sunshine State. Is there any better place on the planet than to grow cannabis than right here? Let's talk economics, people. We could be the cannabis basket of the whole world. And it makes a whole lot more sense to grow cannabis than sugarcane in Belglade. Let me tell you something. If we can do this right, if we don't cut out people of color in the supply chain for these cannabis businesses, if we allow people, minorities, women, LGBT, and veterans to become cannabis entrepreneurs, we are going to create, and I mean literally thousands of jobs right here in the Sunshine State.
A source of revenue?
Heck yes, lots of revenue.
Just curious. Let me go back to this. We brought up the issue of criminal justice. So we're talking about that. So when juveniles are let out of detention centers, they often find themselves back on the streets. And again, this is not just applicable to juveniles. They wind up back on the streets with no real program to rehabilitate them back into society. When I worked in Tampa, Andrew Warren from the 13th Judicial Court put in a program there to help kids, first-time offenders. If elected, what would be your plan to spearhead a better way of handling and rehabilitating at-risk youth?
We need to start here by taking a good hard look at what the purpose is of our prison system. Is it just punishment or is it rehabilitation? It needs to be rehabilitation, but that's not how it's functioning now. We put people in, we give them no opportunities to better their lives, and then we throw them out with so few choices, and by the way, in the state of Florida, without the right to vote. First of all, when we are dealing with our young people and our minors and it's nonviolent crimes, our first choice should be diversionary programs, not locking kids up. And if we are sending kids to juvenile detention, we need to make sure they're getting just as good an education, just as much preparation on the inside as they would on the outside. And when it comes to our prison system, we need to make it the same way. There is a revolving door with our prison system because we are so focused on punishment and not reintegrating people into our community. And you know what this is driven by? A for-profit prison system that benefits when we have more criminals.
Thank you.
When we created a prison system that created financial incentives to put people in cages, you should not get surprised if we had more people put in cages. And what is the lowest hanging fruit? Poor people, brown people, and certainly young brown men. That has been true for the longest time. So the first thing we need to do is address the moral and propriety of that. The second thing is we do testing here in Florida to determine whether a kid is at reading level in 3rd grade. And based on that information, we choose to build prisons for them instead of choosing to build reading programs for them. Explain to me how that makes any sense. We spend dollars on jails rather than pennies on preventative programs, and we need to start investing in those children at birth, not pre-K. Pre-K is too late. K is too late, and 12th grade is way too late. We need to be investing in them at birth. That's how we break the cycle of poverty. That's how we give them better opportunity. And we've got to stop branding people with a scarlet A on their forehead if they've made a mistake. We need to give people second chances and welcome back into society. I say ban the box, number one. Don't hold their conviction against them if they can be redeemed. And second of all, absolutely positively give them back their civil rights.
Thank you.
Yes, on 4.
Thank you. Something that affects us all, and that's the economy. And let's start with the minimum wage. It was $3.30. Ms. Baer, the first one. I remember minimum wage when I was growing up at $3.35. What is the minimum wage now? What is your policy as far as minimum wage goes? Should it be
It's pretty
raised?
plain and simple here. If we care about workers being able to earn not just a minimum wage, but a living wage, we need federal legislation that will raise the minimum wage to at minimum $15 an hour. And by the way, that legislation then should also index to inflation so we don't have to wait, so it automatically goes up as costs increase. Once again, this goes back to choices, and I remember the rhetoric around the Republican tax bill. Well, we give a tax cut to corporations, and they're going to use that money to pay their workers more. You know an easy way to pay your workers more? Require that we raise the minimum wage. It's as plain and simple as that.
Ms. Keith, you've seen the videos on the news every once in a while where workers are outside their establishment protesting because they need money to feed their babies. They need money to feed their children. But they don't have that, not just because of the cost of living. What is your position here? Should the minimum wage be raised?
Absolutely, yes. I concur with Lauren, $15 minimum wage, and I want to index not just to inflation, but also local cost of living, because anybody who's tried to rent anything in Florida understands what that means. But I also would like to emphasize how important it is that we support unionization in our country. Unions are a key component to good wages and good benefits for working people. And at every level, the GOP is trying to dismantle union power. That's what charter schools is about, dismantling teachers' unions. That's what privatization of the VA is about, dismantling government worker unions. They want to dismantle union power, and that is something that I stand strongly in opposition of. The last thing I want to tell you is there's a very easy way to require employers to pay their employees more. Require employers to pay their employees more. There's ways of incentivizing better, smarter compensation ideas, because right now the only compensation idea that we have is pay as little as you can possibly get away with. That doesn't help anybody, and the difference is made up by the taxpayers.
Speaking of the economy, are we paying too much in taxes now? No new taxes. Do you plan on raising taxes in the long run? Do you plan on, and maybe you don't plan on raising taxes, but do you see in your future, if you do win the seat, the idea that we as a nation have to raise taxes again?
Let's be clear here. A massive tax cut was given to the most fortunate among us this year. A tax cut that is increasing our deficit by $1.5 trillion. I am in support of repealing those tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires so that they're paying their fair share. When we talk about tax reform, it's got to be equitable tax reform. There are people who genuinely need a tax break. You know who those folks are? Folks in the working class and folks in the middle class. You know who doesn't need a tax break? Millionaires, billionaires, and big corporations. So it's really, once again, an issue of choices and resource allocation here. But our tax code and our tax system has to be fair.
If you could just stay up there for a moment, Ms. Baer.
I'm sorry?
Over the years, I have heard that so many times. I don't know if anyone in the audience is feeling the same way right now. I've heard that a lot over the years. And how has that changed over the years? Because I look at my paycheck and I see more taxes coming out. But everyone says, you know, whenever I go to some type of forum or, you know, something like this, I hear no new taxes.
Well, how it's changed most recently is a Republican Congress that passed a massive tax bill that they called middle-class tax cuts, but that wasn't actually middle-class tax cuts. And that's why you're seeing your tax bills rise while people who live on Palm Beach Island are buying their second or third yacht. I mean, it's really as plain and simple as that. We've got to hold our elected officials accountable. Now, we need tax reform, but it's got to be tax reform that is fair to everyday working people. I read an article the other day about how all of the people who were aides in Congress and helped write the last tax bill, you know what they did? They all just left to become lobbyists for big companies to figure out how to help them avoid and take advantage of more tax loopholes. This is how the revolving door has worked. And until we elect leaders who are going to say our tax code needs to be something that raises revenue but also promotes fairness in our economy, we're not going to see change for average people.
Thank you.
Let me tell you just how twisted this tax cut was. Y'all know that when you paid into Social Security, what did you pay in? Cash. Right? That's what went into the Social Security Trust. The government took that money out as cash and spent it on other stuff. They wrote back to the trust a thing called an IOU. We call it a treasury bond. That treasury bond has a maturation date. Those bonds start coming due in 2020 through 2036. What are we going to pay those bonds with? The money that was supposed to be in a revenue stream that got cut by the Republicans. They cheated you out of your IOU. And so now they tell you how desperately they need to cut Social Security and Medicare. It's an entitlement program. No, the only people who thought they were entitled was you, thought you were entitled to spend my money. That is how wrong it was. We absolutely have to roll back that tax scam. And not only that, but we've got to get corporations to pay their fair share. They may have a higher tax rate, they have low tax participation. They have so many loopholes you could drive a Mack truck through them. Very few of these corporations pay what they owe in revenue. So the vast majority of the money that we spend to maintain our roads and our infrastructure is paid by people like you instead of companies like them. That ain't right.
Thank you. Ms. Baer, what is the biggest issue that you believe millennials face as a whole right now? The biggest issue, I know there are lots of them, we all do, but what is the biggest issue you think millennials face?
think the biggest issue millennials face is an economy that isn't working for them. And that's true across any number of different measures. It's true because of the cost of education. It's true because of the debt millennials come out with. It's true because they're coming out into an economy where there's a dearth of good-paying jobs and a dearth of jobs to begin with. It used to be the case that every successive generation in America had it a little better off than their parents did. But the biggest thing I hear when I talk to millennials, and mostly those who are younger than I am, because I just made the cutoff in 1980, it's this sense of insecurity, of not knowing whether they're going to be able to make it on their own, not knowing when they're going to be able to move out of mom and dad's house, not knowing when they're going to be able to get a job that pays more than minimum wage, not knowing if they're going to ever be able to get married and support a family, and if they do, whether they'll be able to buy a house or whether they'll ever be able to retire.
Thank you. I tell you, you know what? If I ever needed a really good timekeeper, I would just ask Miss Keith to come with me. You've had your eye on those lights the whole time. Go ahead.
I'm going to tell you the biggest issue that the millennials face, in my opinion, is debt. They start out with debt just to get educated. They end up in debt to get a house. They borrow on credit cards to stay afloat. Then they have to take care of their own parents. They borrow to put their own kids through school, and then somehow we're going to cut Medicaid to make sure that you have to pay for grandma's care too. There is no chapter in the life of a millennial that does not involve debt. And so they work to pay bills forever and can never get ahead. And somewhere in that mix, they're supposed to save for their own retirement, as if that's a real thing. The reality is we have created a system that keeps them enslaved to bigger interests who make money off of their hard work. And we are not telling them the truth about that. And on top of all of their personal debt, we are saddling them with trillions of dollars of national debt because of irresponsible, fiscally unsound policy from the GOP. Don't tell me an additional $1.4 trillion doesn't make a difference. We're not the ones who are going to have to pay it. You are. You are saddled with debt, and that's because of our decisions, and I apologize to you for the decisions that my generation has made.
Ms. Baer, anything to add?
I think we agree here. The millennials are facing an economic crisis that has been ignored by current leaders. And the question that we all need to be asking ourselves, particularly millennial voters, is, are you going to elect leaders who are going to work in your economic interest, or are you going to elect leaders who are going to work for special interests? It's plain and simple. It's quite clear.
Something to add?
I would add something. I said it once before, and I will say it again. You know a person by what they do. And you have to be very careful about money. Because money is very important in politics, but it's also very important in people's lives and in their choices. I'm very proud of the fact that I've run a campaign that is funded by individuals, not corporations, not super PACs, not funneled in by party machinery. So when you think about the choices that you make, you have to think about, who is that person serving? Because if their engine is the people, then they will serve the people. And if their engine is the money, they will serve the money.
Pam's right about that. That's why back in February I took a pledge that I'm not taking any money from corporate PACs. $0 from big sugar, $0 from big banks, $0 from big pharma. You know why? Because money has no place, big money, in politics. I told you at the beginning, I started my legal career taking the fight to get money all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that will be a huge priority of mine when I'm elected. Now, let me tell you also this. I am incredibly proud that my campaign has been fueled by more than 8,000 small dollar donors. That's the power of our community to make change. And so when you look at the ledger where Brian Mast has money from all of these corporate interests, and you look at my ledger, you're not going to see that. That makes my job harder. That makes our job harder. But what it also does is put the focus where it should be, which is on the people, on each and every one of you, and on what we can do collectively when we power our elections instead of corporate and special interests.
One last time.
I think it's pretty fair to point out that money can come to a candidate a lot of ways, not just from PACs, but also funneled through a party mechanism. So let's be honest about that for a hot minute. And let's also be honest about this. It is hard to run a race no matter what you do. It is hard to get out and fight for people, to earn their trust and earn their vote. And I think you all understand that. This is not an easy thing to do. You do it out of a spirit of love. You do it because you're called to it, and it's an incredibly challenging thing to do. But I tell you this, the way we change our country is to accept that the process of picking our leaders is as important as the result. You cannot be the party for the little guy who only supports millionaires. It isn't that way. That isn't what works. That isn't the truth. We have to be a party that stands for the values that we espouse. And that is as much true in what we do as in what we say. People lost faith in political parties for a lot of reasons, because they saw themselves no longer reflected in the values and the operations of the machinery. So if we have a hope of re-engaging the people of this district, then we've got to walk the walk, represent them, and be a part of their belief in this process, in this gift that we call democracy.
Thank you. All right, one last thing do you have to add, Ms. Baer, or no? Before we get to the audience.
The one thing I would add to this is why I'm happy that both of the candidates in this election look different than the Democratic nominee you had in the last election, who was a self-funding multimillionaire who put $10 million of his own dollars into this race. What both Pam and I are doing is the hard work of engaging the community, of making our case, of building movements, so that we can defeat Brian Mast in the fall. So let's be grateful, Florida 18 voters, that you've got two candidates on the right side this time.
I'm being asked, do you need a break for 5 minutes?
I'm good.
Anybody?
So it's time
All right, good.
Great
All
job,
right.
ladies. Give them a round of applause, please.
Okay, so this is the part that I fast forwarded to about a half hour ago. I'm ahead of myself today. The question and answer session.
Outstanding.
30 seconds, put that mic down. 30 seconds for each question, 30 seconds to ask each question. I believe the candidate has a minute to respond, 1 minute to respond. So,
Millennial question.
millennial questions, thank you. Your voice.
Go first.
If you could just say who you are, where you're from, and your question.
Hi, my name is Quinn Tucker. I'm from Port St. Lucie. I'm 18 years old. And this question is addressed to both of you. Given Donald Trump's frequent violation of the Annulment Clause and disdain for democratic processes, would you vote to impeach him given the opportunity?
Hell yes. The presidency is not graded on a curve. Things don't become less illegal, less indecent, or less immoral because you like the guy who's doing them. Donald Trump has lied to the American people. He has violated the law. He has obstructed justice, and he's made himself a clown on the national stage. I cannot wait to be the vote to impeach Donald Trump.
I look at this with my lawyer hat on. And I know when you're a lawyer and you walk into a courtroom, the first thing you want to make sure you've got is all of your facts and all of your evidence in order. Which is why I think the first and foremost and most important thing we can be doing as a country right now is protecting Bob Mueller and his investigation. Because when it comes to an impeachment hearing and the credibility of that hearing, that's going to depend on whether Mueller was allowed to finish his investigation and what is in that report. So my first priority is letting Mueller finish doing his job. And then if he produces a report that shows our president, as we all suspect, has committed crimes that would be worthy of impeachment, at that point, I would be a vote.
I would like to respond. I'm sorry. The words out of his own mouth established that he's obstructed justice. He got on national TV and admitted that he fired James Comey in order to stop the Russia investigation. I call that obstruction of justice, and yes, I have a lawyer hat too. We put people in jail for a whole lot less.
Question.
Hello, my name is Chris Bailey from Port St. Lucie.
Hey.
I know a lot of people, both young and old, who would love the convenience of being able to travel to Miami and Orlando easily. How do you feel about bringing a Brightline station to the Treasure Coast? And how do you feel about Brian Mast's opposition to that?
Good question.
So here's what I think about Brightline. The biggest complaint about Brightline when it comes to the Treasure Coast is that this is a train that runs through our community but doesn't benefit our community. It's been all costs, no benefit. Environmental cost, economic cost, cutting straight through downtown Stewart. Now, I know there are a lot of people who oppose Brightline, and there are questions there on the table about things like the validity of its financing. But I can commit to you this. If Brightline is going to go through our community, it must serve our community, and particularly if the community of Fort Pierce wants to see a Brightline station here, that is something I will be an incredibly vocal advocate for. You know why? Because that can be key to the economic redevelopment of this area.
Let's just admit that this was bamboozlement 101A. It was supposed to be about moving people from Miami to Orlando, and it became about moving cargo from Miami to Jacksonville. Can we speak the truth about that? And they did it at great cost to this community by cutting off access through Martin County. Now, if we're going to do a project about moving people, then there's a whole lot smarter projects than Brightline. And I hate the notion of a public-private partnership where the public part is all the risk and the private part is all the profit. St. Lucie can do better, Martin County can do better, and we don't have to just go on to get along. Sometimes you just got to stand up and fight.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, my name is Micah Hartman. I'm one of the owners of Ground Floor Farm in Stewart. First of all, thank you both for coming and answering our questions and being here, and I would be very proud to vote for either of you in the general, 100%. My next question is, how do we promote and inspire and support entrepreneurship? Because while I hear minimum wage raising to 15, the progressive in me is like, yes, absolutely. And then the other side of me that pays the bills for my business is like, I didn't make a salary last month for myself. Paying people minimum wage is like all we can do to stay afloat. And I reconcile, or I understand that there's some difficulties with that. So how can we, as a government and as a nation that prides ourselves in our entrepreneurship, actually support those programs?
I love your question because you're asking a fundamental question about the kind of employment we're going to have in the future. If we're honest, a lot of the jobs that we currently have are going to get automated out of existence. And entrepreneurialism is one of the things that's going to fill the gap. I will tell you this, we make it real hard for small businesses like yours to get access to capital. Access to capital is basically based on your personal assets or your credit rating, right? And we have an Ex-Im Bank for corporations to do business overseas, and we don't have anything that helps small businesses like yours get off the ground. The answer is not to balance the books on the backs of your employees. It's to help your business actually thrive and get access to capital to be a regular stream of revenue to your employees.
Access to capital is an issue. Another one that we need to deal with is how do we incentivize entrepreneurship in the first place? And I think we can do that through our tax code. We've been talking a lot here about tax reform and where do we give tax breaks or not. I think we can give tax breaks to individuals who are going out, who are starting their own businesses, who are growing the local economy, who are going to be employing other people. We've always known that the engine of growth in our economy is from the bottom up, not from the top down, which means that if we're going to be really incentivizing entrepreneurship throughout the Treasure Coast, if we're going to be making this an area that is fertile for people to come and move and live and start their own businesses, then we've got to have a tax code that makes it easier on those folks, not big corporations.
Thank you, Michael. Sure.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Lauren. This is great. Thank you for taking us seriously. We are the future. I'm so glad that we touched towards the very end on campaign finance. This is my major issue, and it is the major issue of most of my age cohort. And I think it is the unifying factor in all of the issues that we discussed today. Algae, big sugar, mass incarceration, private prison system, EPA gutting and environmental degradation, petrochemical industry. I applaud both of you for running a individual contribution campaign and staying away from PACs and business donations. What can we do? What will you do specifically to fight for campaign finance reform besides overturning Citizens United? I wish we could, but if Kavanaugh is confirmed, we're in big trouble. If any of Trump's short list are confirmed, we're in big trouble for a long time. What can you do besides Citizens United?
Well, this is an issue that I take really seriously, and I've taken seriously for a long time. As I mentioned, I was part of a legal team that, after Citizens United, took a case up to the Supreme Court that limited the reach of that decision. So if you think it's bad with Citizens United, it could have been a whole lot worse if we didn't do our job well. Now, my wife Emily spent 4 years working at the Federal Election Commission as an enforcement attorney, and part of the reason that she left is because she wasn't actually allowed to enforce the law. So one of the easiest things we can do is get the Federal Election Commission working again. Right now, it's got 6 commissioners, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. You know what that guarantees? Gridlock. Why don't we move to a 7-member commission like we see at the SEC? Also, why don't we pass legislation about disclosure? If dark money forces were required to come out in the light and say who they were, you know what you would see? You'd see a lot less money in politics. Let's stop having these ads on TV, Americans for America, and start requiring people to say what you're funding and making it clear why you're funding it. That's going to go a long way to improving our system.
Can we be honest? Can we be honest? Dark money comes into the Democratic Party from some of those same prison companies and some of that big sugar enterprises and that same stuff, and it gets funneled to chosen candidates through the DCCC and the DSCC and the DNC. I'm sorry, but that is in fact the truth. So if we want to get money out of politics, we got to start the party to start living its own values. We can't point the finger at the other side without looking within. That's number one. Number two, we need to stop thinking that wealth is a qualification for leadership. It's not. We're learning that the hard way with Donald Trump. And we've learned that the hard way with a whole lot of other people. Coming from a means should not be a reason for a party to select you. The people ought to be choosing who speaks for them, because quite frankly, the parties are owned by the people. There are leaders in Washington who have forgotten that. They've gotten so comfortable in their positions that they think they get to recruit and decide who's going to be on the team. They could not be more wrong. The team doesn't belong to them, it belongs to us. So if we want to clean up money in politics, the first thing we have to do is look within.
Thank you.
So my question is, Florida does not currently have a statewide law that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, or public accommodations. How do you plan on addressing this situation? Is it a list of a priority for you? And are you willing to work with Republicans / the Trump administration?
Good question.
This could not be more of a priority for me. As everyone in this room should know, I'm a proud member of the LGBT community. I have a wife, Emily. I have a beautiful daughter, Serena. And up until 2003, it wouldn't have been legal in the state of Florida for us to even be in a relationship. Our marriage was not legal here until 2015. Florida, you're right, needs a statewide law that ensures that we don't have discrimination in hiring, in employment, in public accommodation. But you know what we need? We need a federal civil rights law that recognizes protections for LGBT persons. And there's one out there right now, and it's called the Equality Act, and for years, Republicans have refused to pass it. No individual should have to face the sting of discrimination because of who they are or who they love. I know that because I've lived it. And it would be my utmost duty and responsibility, if I were elected, to ensure that each and every American has equal rights and equal opportunity.
Ms. Keith, have you lived that, and do you want to make this legislation?
Absolutely. One of my duties as a naval judge advocate was defending sailors and Marines that were getting kicked out of the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was my job to argue for them that their contributions to the military far surpassed any discomfort anybody had. And you know the thing? Most people weren't uncomfortable at all. This was about the psychological priorities of some people based in hate, rather than accepting people for who they were. I went to the wall for those people, and I watched their lives get destroyed. I could not be more disappointed in Brian Mast than he co-signed on Donald Trump's disrespect of transgender Americans. He said he was okay with kicking them out of the military. I'd be okay with kicking racist bigots and discriminators out of the military, because that's really what we need to do.
Now
Hello,
tell us how
guys.
you really feel.
No, that's how I really feel.
My name is Henry Duhart, and I'm a lifelong resident of Fort Pierce, Florida. One of the issues that we face is that 60% of our populations are trying to survive on $25,000 with full family homes within the city of Fort Pierce. So often the city of Fort Pierce also is left behind in the progression of this entire county. How do you, representing us, will make sure that the borderline does not stop the progression of any city within this county, specifically speaking of Fort Pierce, with the poverty levels that we suffer from since I can remember.
Thank you, sir.
This couldn't be more important to me, because I know as a representative, your job is to represent all of your constituents. Not some of them, not part of them, not just Port St. Lucie, but the entirety of St. Lucie County. That's why I'm proud that last week we opened a new office on Avenue D. I think representing the community of Fort Pierce starts with being in the community of Fort Pierce and listening to people from Fort Pierce. That's why, even before we opened our office, I invited community leaders to come into our office, to share their thoughts, to share their priorities, to tell me what they wanted to see for their own community, because who are we to assume that we know best? You know who knows best for Fort Pierce? Fort Pierce knows best for Fort Pierce.
I'm going to respectfully disagree. I'm going to tell you that choices are made at the state and municipal level all the time that marginalized communities of color and have for a long time. If Fort Pierce knew best what's for Fort Pierce, it wouldn't be suffering like it is now. It takes all of us to care about Fort Pierce, not just Fort Pierce. And it ain't about opening an office in a neighborhood. There are some things that you learn from experience. And one of those things is what it feels like when somebody looks at you like you're not worth anything because of the way that you look. When you look through Fort Pierce, when you are in Fort Pierce, you see a community that has pride, talent, creativity, and capability. But what it doesn't have is fiscal investment, new roads, new schools, new books, and new opportunities. The difference is where your passion is.
Hello, my name's Andres Rodriguez. I actually grew up here in the county, Hope Sound Elementary. Anybody in here? So I'd like to ask, we're so, first of all, grateful that we have two candidates who are so clearly on the right side, so I want to acknowledge that. Thank you guys so much. That being said, regardless of the results of the primary election, can we have each candidate pledge their support for whoever might be the nominee come November?
Andres, that's a great question. And let me say loud and clear the same thing I said on the first day of my campaign when this was one of the first questions that I was asked. Our priority in November is defeating Pry and Mast. And I will work as hard as I can with every bone in my body to elect whichever Democrat comes out of this primary, whether that is me or Pam Keith.
I agree. Everything that I have done in this campaign is about building resources, human resources, and I will absolutely make sure that the human resources that I build will support Lauren if she prevails. I'm sure that the financial resources that she builds, she'd pledge to me should I prevail.
Thank you. That's going to be the last three of you on the line, please. Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening, Mark Boston, retired out of the United Auto Workers for 25 years. 1974 until today, I've always pushed single-payer health care. What will you do for the people? What do you want to see from cradle to grave in health care for our citizens?
I am on record as being fully in support of Medicare for all single-payer health care from cradle to grave. I'm going to tell you why. We went wrong back in the 1940s when we made health care something that employers provided to their employees. It cut out of the system all those people who were not employed, including women who stayed at home with the family. That was a wrong choice back then. It was sort of a shortcut to avoid paying higher wages. But the reality is that a person's entitlement to health care is not based on their employment. It should be based on their citizenship. That is the baseline. Healthcare is a right. You should have healthcare coverage from birth to death and every chapter in between. And absolutely, yes, we can fund that because that's the kind of a country that I want to have. And if we choose that, we make that.
I believe that healthcare is a fundamental human right, and that in the wealthiest country in the world, each and every American should have health care, and it's the government's responsibility to make that happen. Now, I think the fastest way to make that happen is to expand Medicare and Medicaid access to all Americans. And the easiest way to make that happen, and you can do this tomorrow, is to allow individuals and companies to start buying into Medicare and Medicaid. What that allows us to do is expand opportunity to get into these programs more quickly without the length of time and the difficulties it takes to transition to single payer.
Thank you.
I'm Diane Goldberg, St. Lucie Audubon Conservation Chair. And one of the important issues right now are biosolids. That's treated sewage, sometimes only partially treated when it's Class B, and considered fertilizer when you add compost to Class A. We are putting it down on sod and feed farms. It's runoff from the Kissimmee River into Lake Okeechobee, as well as put on around our area where it gets into our groundwater, it washes into our canals, and is allowed with permits by the DEP to be taken off of these farms and put into our waters. And this is one of the problems we're having, not only in this area, but countrywide. This is an issue everywhere. I would like to know if you will work for legislation to not allow this to put on any of our farms, and instead there are new innovations coming up for use for electricity. We need more sources that will not, will reduce climate change. So we are going to need everywhere grants from both state and the federal government to work on this. How will you work on that?
We need to start by stopping what's been going on in Washington right now, which is giving a free pass to any polluter to go out there and bury their waste or dump it in our water or release it in our air. It's an Orwellian type situation when the Environmental Protection Agency right now is functioning in a way that benefits polluters more than it protects the environment. So I'm strongly in favor of EPA regulation of biosolids, and I'd acknowledge that biosolids aren't the only problem we're dealing with. We've got to get the EPA working again. Don't be fooled. Scott Pruitt's out the door, but his number 2 may be even worse. And what that means is that Democrats in Congress are going to need to be on the watch for environmental protection, whether that comes with respect to biosolids, whether it comes with respect to what we're dumping into Lake Okeechobee, or whether it comes with respect to what we're releasing into our air. There couldn't be more important problem.
Here's the thing you need to know. If Brian Mast is sent back to Washington, your issue will not be addressed, because he plays on a team that doesn't believe in environmental stewardship at all. And that starts with their fiscal decisions by gutting the budget of the EPA, rolling back regulations that are designed to keep pollutants out of our water, and the budgets for the entities that actually measure the pollutants in our water. You know, and I know, that even the regulations that govern our septic system are not high enough. We are seeing all kinds of pollutants and contaminants in our water and in the biosolids that are left behind from that system. The bottom line is this. If you believe in environmental stewardship, you really can't trust the GOP, because they don't. And even if they say so right here, right now, they back people that gut environmental protection. That is the truth.
Thank you. We're running a bit behind, so I have time for 2 more questions from the audience, please. More questions? 3. It's my old eyes. All right, let me make that announcement again for the last 3 questions. How's that? Good? Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Barbara Bernadine, and I drove from Palm Beach County to be here tonight. And I think we have 2 incredible candidates running for a great seat. But I must say, the first time that I met Ms. Baer, you stole my heart. So, but either way, I think it will be a great seat for either one of you. And I came here at age 17. July 15th of this year is gonna make it 18 years since I've been in the United States. I still consider this country as a great country. I am not a US citizen. And I think I'm more involved than any US citizen that I've known personally, as far as the work that I've done in my own community. And I know one of the questions you had asked was, do you support free college for our millennials? And I think both of you agree the answer was yes. As an immigrant, I totally disagree with that. I put myself through college. I worked. I didn't have no financial aid. I wasn't qualified for it. I didn't have any scholarship. I worked and I put myself to college and I graduated. So I'm a college graduated. And for that purpose only, as an immigrant, I don't support free college. I think there are many ways that we can go to college and we have to make it work. But my question to you is, as candidate, the focus for the Millenial Forum was how have you been engaged with our youth in conversation to encourage them to be more involved, to vote and more involved in their community. So what have you done, or what are you currently doing besides running for office to encourage those youth to involved in their community, not just vote when they are shooting in the schools, but before that, what have you done in the past? We want to know that. So thank you.
Excellent question.
Thank you so much. First of all, because you had really two questions there, I want to point out an important distinction between what Pam and I thought on college. I'm in favor of loan forgiveness if you go into public service after you graduate, but not free college up front. What that means is that you have the choice after you come out. Now, when it comes to engaging millennials, that is the heart and soul of my campaign. I would love every volunteer for Team Baer who's actually a millennial to stand up. This is how I'm engaging millennials. Millennials are at the core of my campaign. I am reaching out to our high school students, our college students. I am telling them and working with them to help motivate their own community, because you know who's the best motivator for a millennial? Another millennial. And they have been doing incredible work. Let me tell you, this team has made more than 47,000 phone calls. They have knocked thousands of doors. They are the ones who are going to change the voting population of Florida 18, because they're going to encourage their peers to get out to vote.
Thank you. So, Ms. Keith, what are you doing actively right now to engage millennials?
Interestingly enough, this is not my first rodeo. I, in fact, ran last time in 2016. I'm the first African-American woman ever to run a qualified campaign for United States Senate in Florida history. In that process, not only did I have in a team entirely of millennial staff, not volunteers, but paid millennials, which, by the way, my entire paid staff now is millennials. But I served as an example from the very beginning. I taught millennial people, first of all, that they don't have to wait their turn, that they can lead right now. I told them that they could choose their lane. They didn't have to listen to somebody tell you, oh, you don't belong here. It ain't your turn. It isn't your style. I showed by example what intrepidness really means, and how you can take a step forward and take another step and forge your own path. I am so proud of the fact that I trust young people to guide my campaign, but to guide our future. That's the way to go. I would like to say one thing to you, miss, about free college. If you've actually lived in the struggle, that you know that some people will never get to college unless the money is there first. Paying for it after the fact does not fix the problem for people who come from impoverished families.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Rochelle Politano. I also traveled from Jupiter today to come up here. So my question actually has to do with, first of all, I would like to address taxes. I was raised with the fact that our family didn't serve our country, so my dad instilled in me the value of that is how we serve our country then. We pay our taxes. We support our country through our taxes, and it is a form of patriotism. It isn't a form of robbery. And I would like to address that because it seems like so often our taxes get considered as a bad thing, and it shouldn't, which leads me to my question of there seems to be a decline in trust in our public institutions, just in our public funding and stuff like that. And we get sold on privatization of a lot of things. That concerns me greatly because I have seen privatization of public, certainly in the public service industry, such as ambulances and small towns having to replace their pipes through a private corporate or private money. And it doesn't seem to work. I remember when it was public funded for grants and stuff for universities for where they would, for music, for medicine. And that medicine, when it's through public funding, it is a public knowledge then. It's through everybody for the private world then to develop it and compete. Think of how different Monsanto would have happened if that seed had been through public funding. What are you going to do to restore our faith in our public institutions, our public funding of roads, highways, dams, all of that? It has done wonderful things, and I would like that restored.
I think we need to address the moral underpinning that is going on here. The GOP selling the notion that the best way to do something is through a private enterprise where a small handful of men get really, really wealthy in doing it. Right? They think that that's the way our prison should be. They think that's the way our VA should be. They think the way that our public education should be, and they could not be more wrong, because those are designed to be a public service. Nobody should be getting fat off of putting people in jail. So, let's address the moral underpinning first. Public service is about public service, period. And not about wealth attainment for the few. That is the first thing. The second thing is, it is a lie that our government doesn't work. Go to another country for a hot minute. I used to live in Brazil. I've lived in Morocco, Syria, Egypt. I've lived in Bahrain. Trust and believe I can tell you that the United States does work. Can it work better? Absolutely. But it is a lie to say that the post office and the FAA and all of those various government agencies that serve us are bad at what they do. No, they are not. They are very good at what they do. And it is us that make them better.
Thank you.
Well, maybe there's a bit of a disagreement here, because I think there's one part of our government that's not working very well at all, and that's our Republican-controlled Congress. Now, the reason people don't trust the tax system is because what happens is good, hard-working people pay into the system, while tax breaks are given to the ultra-wealthy, which increases the deficit, which Republicans then use as an excuse to cut the benefits like Medicare and Social Security that hardworking people need in the first place. So we need to restore integrity to our system here, get our tax system working for the American people again. And I couldn't agree with you more. The answer is not privatization. It is not privatization of our public services, privatization of the VA. It is, on the contrary, investment in those agencies, modernization of them so that they are prepared to deal with the problems of the future. We know in America that we can build great institutions and we can build great things if we are willing to put in the hard work. Don't outsource it. Let's do it ourselves.
Thank you.
My name is Sienna Medina.
Can you speak up, please?
Okay. Hi, my name is Sienna Medina.
Can you hear her? Okay.
Is the speaker on? No, the speakers are out. Speaker is out? Okay.
Hello.
Check, check.
This one's out.
Here.
Out, in, out. This one's in.
Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
That speaker's out, but the rest of them are okay.
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 My name is Sienna Medina. I'm 17. I go to Fort Pierce Central High School. I'm Mexican, and my family has experienced a lot of discrimination in the past. Do you believe in Trump's idea of denaturalization? And if not, how do you plan to challenge that?
I heard her. You're from Mexico, and do you believe?
I'm Mexican, and do they believe in denaturalization?
Right. Do they?
Or
The
how
question.
would you challenge that?
Do they believe in denaturalization?
I'll take that. No, no, and no. What Donald Trump is doing, what denaturalization is trying to strip citizenship from Americans. Plain and simple. Now, he's trying to do this under the guise of presidential discretion, but this is what I'll tell you, it's an abuse of discretion. It's an abuse of authority. Back when I was a lawyer, part of what I did was work to help refugees and asylum seekers gain legal status here in the United States. Let me tell you, once those folks became Americans, they were the most proud, the most hardworking, the most law-abiding Americans that I knew. It is a dangerous, dangerous turn for our country when we are trying to strip citizenship of people because of the color of their skin. And I would do everything I could to oppose that.
Hermanita, estoy sí contenta que tú estás aquí con nosotros. Tú es valuable. She is valuable. She's an American. She is here. She contributes, and she matters. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever to strip people of their naturalization. It's grounded in the most xenophobic, immoral instinct to say that we want a country with only our type here and not your type. Unfortunately, this isn't the first chapter in our history where there were people who thought that way. There were people who thought that way about the Irish. They were wrong. There were people who thought that way about the Italians. They were wrong. There were people who thought that way about the Japanese. They were wrong. In fact, they have never, ever been right. The bottom line is this. We are a tapestry of immigrants. Each one adds specific, special contributions that are not measured in the color of their skin or even the dollars they contribute to our coffers, but in the connections that they make between and amongst us. You matter. Your family matters. And I understand that the fight doesn't only happen in Congress. The fight for your right to be here is right here. And I'm not going to go to Washington to fight for you. I'm right here fighting with you.
All right, that brings us to our closing. Sorry? Yeah, closing statements. 2.5 minutes each. Who would like to begin? Lauren?
Sure, Mike's back on. I want to start by thanking the organizers, by thanking Nigel and Alejandro. If you want to know what kind of change millennials are going to make in the world, you only need to look at what you two have done in organizing this forum right here. I want to thank each and every one of you who's come here, regardless of where you've come from or whose t-shirt you're wearing. I want to thank all of those of you who are tuning in online, because I'll finish where I started. This right here is what democracy looks like. When we get up, when we get out of our homes, when we get engaged in our communities. You've spent the last more than an hour listening to me and Pam. Let me tell you, my campaign has mostly been about listening to each and every one of you. Because I believe in politics, there are too many politicians who are interested in hearing the sound of their own voice. They're interested in their 15 minutes of fame on Twitter or Facebook Live. But they're not interested in hearing the stories of people in their community who are suffering. They're not interested in reaching out to each and every one of us. I mentioned to you that my team has done the hard work of calling more than 47,000 people, of knocking on thousands of doors, of spending each and every day in our community, from West Palm Beach to Fort Pierce, from Stewart to Indiantown. And the reason that I do that is because I know that you and your ideas are the heart and soul of what's going to drive change in Washington. A representative has one job, and that is to represent the people of their community. And the only way you're going to do that job well is if you listen to them. Now, I've had many different jobs in my life. I've been a lawyer, I've been a national security expert, I have been a mom. And what I've learned from all of those is that true leadership comes from never compromising on your values, but always, always, always working towards solutions. I can guarantee you that if I earn your trust today and I earn your trust tomorrow and I earn your trust on election day and I hold your trust thereafter, I will be a solutions-oriented leader. I will work with you to actually get our Congress working again. I'm excited because this is something that we can do together. I encourage you to join our team. I am excited about what the future holds. The stakes could not be higher for all of us this year. So get out and vote. Do it on August 28th. Do it again on November 6th. And together, we will be victorious in November in beating Brian Mast.
Thank you.
See, here's what I know. Democrats are not often wrong. Too often, Democrats are weak. What we find is that in today's politics, there's a team that's willing to do just about anything in the name of wrong. So it's high time we have a team that's willing to do something in the name of right. There are those people who are principally concerned with listening, and that's cool, but it's far more important to be leading. And to be a leader, you need to understand who your troops are. There are those who think that their troops are the people in the halls of Congress. They spend all their time trying to convince each other, and when things go terribly sideways, they shake their fist railing at what went wrong. How dare you, sir? How dare you trample upon the Constitution? How dare you not give a Supreme Court justice a hearing? How dare you? But the people know that the stakes are so much higher now. We need so much more. And unfortunately, it isn't going to be Nancy Pelosi, it's not going to be Chuck Schumer that saved this republic. It's going to be us. It's going to be us. The good news is that we have that skill, we have that capacity. If you're part of Mom's Demand, if you're part of Me Too, if you're part of Never Again, if you're part of Black Lives Matter, hell, because you are here, you know that the fight has never been more important. There will never be an election that is more consequential, and there will never be called upon to make a smarter decision about somebody going to Washington and straightening out the ship. But let me tell you something, I am not a namby-pamby Democrat. I am a cage-fighting MMA Democrat. It's about time that we showed some mettle. It's about time that we stood up, that we said equality matters, justice matters, diversity matters, American values matter, and sometimes it takes a warrior to defeat a warrior. Now, I don't have a problem finding solutions. I don't have a problem compromising. I don't even have a problem reaching across the aisle. But when the other team has closed the doors on the other side of that aisle, I am willing to knock them down. My name is Pam Keith. I'm a veteran who served my country. I am deeply patriotic. But I'm here to tell you that there is a new patriotism. Because it's not about loving America. It's about loving Americans.
All right, so one last round of applause for Ms. Keith and Ms. Baer. Thank you. Thank you for being here.